What if I told you that one of the most famous landmarks on Mount Everest isn't a flag, a shrine, or a marker placed by humans, but the frozen body of a man who dreamt of glory, who wanted to prove himself against the highest peak in the world, and whose death would ignite one of the most disturbing ethical debates in the history of mountaineering. This is the story of Tsewang Paljor, known across the world as Green Boots. And before we dive in, make sure you're following Ben's Stories, where we bring you the most haunting, true stories from the edge of human endurance. In the mid-1990s, Everest fever was spreading across the globe. The highest mountain on Earth, 29,032 feet above sea level, was no longer just the sacred mother goddess of the world, as the Sherpas called her. It was becoming a trophy, a challenge for nations, for teams, for individuals desperate to etch their names into history. For India, a country with its own proud tradition of Himalayan mountaineering, Everest represented more than a peak. It was a symbol of prestige. And in 1996, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police Force, or ITBP, sent a team of climbers to plant the Indian flag on the summit. Among them was a young man named Tsewang Paljor. Paljor was not just any mountaineer. Born in a small village in Ladakh, high in the Himalayas, he grew up in an environment where mountains were not merely scenery. They were guardians, teachers, and sometimes graveyards. As a boy, Paljor would look at the snow-capped ranges surrounding his village and wonder what lay beyond them. Those dreams led him into the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, where his physical endurance and quiet determination quickly made him stand. By 1996, at the age of just 28, Paljor had earned his place on the Indian Everest expedition. For him, it was not just about reaching the summit. It was about bringing honor to his family, his village, and his nation. But Everest, as history shows us again and again, does not bend to human ambition. The ITBP team set out with determination, but also with challenges. Resources were limited. Unlike some Western expeditions that were equipped with state-of-the-art gear, satellite communications, and commercial guides, the Indian team relied heavily on their discipline and training as soldiers. They were climbing in an era before the Everest industry exploded with guided tours, yet they faced the same brutal realities: unpredictable weather, thin oxygen, and the mountain's deadly indifference. Paljor's team aimed for the summit, from the North Ridge through Tibet, a route notorious for its isolation and exposure. Few climbers passed that way, and it lacked the bustling activity of the South Col route from Nepal. On that side of the mountain, if something went wrong, you were very much alone. On May 10, 1996, as Palor and his teammates pushed higher, the mountain was about to unleash one of its deadliest storms in modern history. While on the Nepal side, several commercial expeditions, including those led by Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, were caught in a blizzard that would claim 8 lives. The Indian team on the Tibetan side was marching toward its own tragedy. Accounts differ about what exactly happened during those final hours, but one thing is certain. Paljor and 2 other members of the ITBP team pressed on toward the summit despite worsening weather. Driven by patriotism, ambition, and the sheer will to achieve what so few humans had done before, they continued climbing even as the winds roared and snow blinded their vision. At 3:45 p.m. on May 10, 1996, they reportedly radioed that they had reached the summit of Mount Everest. For Paljor, it should have been the proudest moment of his life. But in mountaineering, the summit is only half the journey. The true challenge begins with getting back down alive. The storm intensified. Visibility dropped. Temperatures plunged. The thin line between life and death snapped quickly. As the hours passed, the Indian climbers were trapped high on the mountain with little chance of escape. One by one, they vanished into the storm. Sometime during the night, Paljor found himself near a small rock overhang, a shallow limestone cave along the route known as the Northeast Ridge. Exhausted, out of oxygen, and unable to go further, he crawled inside to take shelter. He never came out. When the storm cleared, other climbers ascending Everest stumbled upon his body. Paljor was lying on his side, curled against the cold stone, his head turned toward the path, as if still watching the climbers who would come after him. On his feet were his distinctive neon green mountaineering boots. And so, without ever choosing it, Tsewang Paljor became immortalized as Green Boots. His frozen body became a grim marker at about 27,190 feet, a waypoint every climber on the North Ridge route would pass on their way to the summit. For some, he was a warning. For others, he was simply part of the mountain. But for all, he became impossible to ignore. Why was his body left there? Why did so many climbers pass him, sometimes even stopping to rest beside him, without bringing him down? These questions would ignite an ethical firestorm. On Everest, where every ounce of oxygen, every step, and every heartbeat is stretched to its limit, what do we owe to another human being in distress? Is leaving someone behind an act of cruelty or a grim necessity for survival? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many people in the years after his death sat down next to Green Boots, trying not to look into his lifeless eyes before continuing their march toward their own dream of the summit? The story of Tsewang Paljor was only beginning to echo across the world. When climbers first discovered Tsewang Paljor's body in the days following the storm of May 1996, many assumed that eventually the Indian authorities or his comrades would retrieve him. After all, he was not just any mountaineer, he was a young soldier who had given his life for a national expedition. Surely he deserved a proper burial. But Everest does not forgive sentiment. At nearly 28,000 feet, where oxygen levels are 1/3 of what they are at sea level, lifting your own body is a struggle, let alone moving another human being. Paljor's frozen corpse weighed as much as stone, anchored in ice. To move him even a few feet would have required enormous effort, risking the lives of those who tried. And so, he stayed. Year after year, as more climbers attempted the North Ridge, they found him exactly where he had fallen, lying in that limestone cave, his neon green boots unmistakable against the pale snow and gray rock. For some, the first sight of him was a shock, an undeniable reminder that death was always just one misstep away. For others, he became a waypoint, a chilling but practical marker along the climb. Climbers would say, after Green Boots Cave, it's another 2 hours to the summit. His body, without consent, became part of Everest's map. Imagine this. You are gasping for air, every muscle burning, your brain fogged from lack of oxygen. You crawl past a small cave, and there he is, a man frozen in time, his face buried in his jacket, his hand still clutching at the stone. He looks almost as if he might wake up, stand, and join you. But he never does. Some climbers whispered a quiet prayer as they passed. Others avoided looking, keeping their eyes fixed on the rope. And a few, in the cruel calculus of Everest, sat down right next to him to catch their breath, resting against the stone, shoulder to shoulder with a corpse. Think about that. To survive, to keep moving, they had to treat a dead man as if he were part of the mountain. News of Paljor's fate spread quickly. As the tragedies of 1996 were dissected by journalists, authors, and survivors, the story of the Indian climber with green boots began to stand out. Should climbers have tried to help him? This question tore through the mountaineering community. Some argued that in the death zone above 8,000 meters, it is nearly impossible to save another person. Every step, every breath is borrowed. Carrying someone down is almost unthinkable. Survival demands brutal choices, but others saw it differently. They argued that humanity should not vanish at altitude, that turning a blind eye to a dying man, even if it meant sacrificing your summit, was a failure of moral duty. Paljor's lonely vigil in the cave became a symbol of this debate. For decades afterward, mountaineers, ethicists, and even ordinary people who had never seen a mountain wrestled with the same haunting question: what would you do if you found him alive, begging for help? It is believed that in the years after his death, hundreds of climbers passed by green boots. Some paused, some snapped photos, some ignored him entirely. There were even reports of climbers during desperate storms crawling into the cave and huddling next to his frozen body for shelter. Paljor in death still offered companionship to the living, but each passing raised the same uncomfortable truth. Everest was not just a mountain, it was a graveyard, and the people buried there were not anonymous. They had names, dreams, families, waiting at home. As his image circulated, photographs of the small cave, the neon green boots, the lifeless form, something terrible happened. Paljor became less of a man and more of a myth. He was no longer Tsewang Paljor, son of a family in Ladakh, a 28-year-old soldier with a gentle smile. He was simply Green Boots, and that nickname, as morbid as it was, stuck. Journalists wrote about him. Documentaries showed him. Climbers gave directions based on him. Without meaning to, the world stripped away his identity and reduced him to an object, an eternal reminder of the cost of ambition. But behind that nickname was still a human story. A young man who believed in something larger than himself, who wanted to stand at the roof of the world, and who probably never imagined that the world would remember him only for how he died. The year 1996 remains infamous in mountaineering history. The blizzard on Everest killed at least 8 climbers on the Nepal side and 3 on the Tibetan side. Books like Into Thin Air turned it into legend. But for many, the single image that stayed in their minds was not of a storm or of teams battling the elements. It was of a man with green boots, frozen forever in a cave. And so the story of Green Boots became inseparable from the story of Everest itself. Every climber who attempts the North Ridge today knows they will see him. They know that he is waiting, a silent sentinel on the path. And whether they admit it or not, every climber must make peace with the same uncomfortable thought. One day, that could be me. By the early 2000s, Green Boots was no longer just a grim curiosity known only to mountaineers. He had become a symbol, a question mark hanging over the entire climbing community. Why do we climb past the dead? Why do we allow the mountain to become a cemetery? And most importantly, what does it say about human nature when ambition outweighs compassion? To understand the debate, one must first understand what climbers call the death zone. Any altitude above 8,000 meters, 26,247 feet, is a place where the human body begins to shut down. The air contains only a third of the oxygen at sea level. Every step feels like running a marathon. Muscles starve, vision blurs, judgment falters. Even with bottled oxygen, survival is measured in hours. Up there, your body is literally dying, cell by cell. Now imagine finding another human being in that state, collapsed, freezing, gasping for air. Helping them would mean sharing your oxygen, slowing your pace, possibly forfeiting your own life. On Everest, the brutal math often dictates that saving one could mean dooming two, and yet, the moral weight of leaving someone behind never fades. Over the years, countless climbers documented their encounters with Green Boots. Some said they felt sick to their stomach as they crawled past him, unable to look at his face. Others admitted that the sight of him filled them with dread, forcing them to confront their own mortality. A few climbers confessed that in their exhaustion, they felt nothing at all. To them, green boots was just another obstacle, like a rock or a patch of ice. And then there were those who paused, whispered a prayer, or left a small token, an offering of respect to a man they never knew. Every story was different, but they all carried the same echo. Once you see him, you cannot unsee him. The debate over Everest's ethics exploded in 2006, 10 years after Paljor's death, when a British climber named David Sharp was found dying in the very same cave as Green Boots. Sharp had attempted to climb Everest alone, with minimal oxygen and support. On his descent, he collapsed in Green Boots' cave, barely conscious. Over 40 climbers passed by him that day. Some thought he was Green Boots. Others realized he was alive but concluded they could not help without risking themselves. By the time anyone tried to intervene, it was too late. Sharp froze to death in the exact same spot as Tsewang Paljor. The world was outraged. Headlines screamed, "Did climbers leave a man to die?" Politicians, mountaineers, and armchair critics debated fiercely. Was this simply the cold reality of Everest, or proof that mountaineering had lost its soul? Suddenly, Green Boots' cave was no longer just a landmark. It was a symbol of humanity's darkest dilemma: survival versus compassion. Green Boots was not alone on Everest. By the 2000s, it was estimated that over 200 bodies lay scattered along its slopes. Some were hidden beneath snow and ice, revealed only when the glaciers shifted. Others, like Paljor, remained in plain sight, frozen mid-step, arms outstretched, faces contorted in their final moments. Each body told a story. Each was a warning. Yet each was also a reminder of the cost people were willing to pay for a chance at the summit. Everest was no longer just the tallest mountain in the world. It was the highest graveyard. The more famous Green Boots became, the more troubling his legacy grew. Tourists and climbers began referring to him casually, as if he were an object, not a man. Directions were given based on him. Photographs circulated online without context. Slowly, Tsewang Paljor disappeared from memory. In his place was just Green Boots, a nickname, a waypoint, a macabre attraction. And yet every time his story resurfaced, people remembered he had a family in Ladakh. He was 28 years old. He had dreams, laughter, and love. He was not just a pair of boots sticking out of the snow. He was a man. So the question lingered. Should bodies like Paljor's be removed? Some argued yes, that climbers deserve dignity, that Everest should not be littered with corpses. Others countered that it was nearly impossible. The cost, danger, and logistics of recovery at such altitude were staggering. And so, year after year, Paljor remained, watching, waiting, reminding. For every climber who passed him, the question was not just, "Can I make it to the summit?" It was also, "If I fall, will I become the next Green Boots?" By the 2010s, Green Boots was no longer just a story told among mountaineers. His image had spread worldwide, featured in documentaries, articles, and viral internet posts. For many, he became the most recognizable figure on Everest, more famous in death than he ever was in life. But with that fame came uncomfortable questions. In 2007, reports surfaced that Green Boots' body had finally been removed. Some said climbers had carried him away. Others claimed the Chinese side of Everest had quietly ordered bodies along the route to be covered. But the truth was more complicated. In reality, Green Boots was not gone. He had simply been moved, pushed out of sight, tucked behind rocks to shield him from cameras and casual climbers. Why? Because the world was watching. Tourists didn't want to see a corpse on their bucket list climb. Commercial expeditions feared bad publicity. Everest had become big business and green boots was bad for the brand. But he was still there. Always there. By this time, Everest had transformed. No longer a sacred challenge for elite mountaineers, it was a commercial enterprise. Wealthy clients could pay guides upwards of $60,000 to lead them to the top. Helicopters ferried supplies. Teams installed fixed ropes and ladders. Each season, hundreds crowded the same narrow path to the summit. Photographs went viral of climbers, standing in line at 8,800 meters, waiting their turn as if at an amusement park. And in those lines, they still passed the silent figure of Green Boots. He had become the mountain's most infamous witness to humanity's obsession, watching, decade after decade, as the world streamed past. Meanwhile, far from Everest, the family of Tsewang Paljor lived with a different reality. His mother, in interviews, said she prayed her son's body would one day return home. His relatives felt torn between grief and pride. Grief at the way he was remembered. Pride that he had died in pursuit of something greater. But decades later, Paljor still has not returned. For his loved ones, Everest is not just the roof of the world. It is the place that stole their son forever. Should Green Boots and the others be brought down? Experts are divided. On one hand, climbers deserve dignity. Families deserve closure. On the other hand, removing a frozen body from the death zone is nearly impossible. It requires a large team, immense resources, and even then, it risks more lives. Some attempts have been made. Occasionally, teams succeed in bringing bodies lower down, draping them in flags, or burying them under cairns of stone. But most remain, where they fell, preserved forever by the cold. The mountain keeps what it takes. In 2014, tragedy struck again when an avalanche killed 16 Sherpas. In 2015, an earthquake triggered another avalanche that swept through Everest Base Camp. Each new disaster brought more bodies to the slopes, joining the silent company of Paljor. And yet, climbers kept coming. Each year, more than 600 reached the summit. Each year, more die trying. The cycle continues. For some, Green Boots is a deterrent. For others, he is almost an attraction. For all, he is a reminder. Everest is not a playground. It is a graveyard. Today, nearly 3 decades after his death, Green Boots remains on the mountain. Sometimes hidden, sometimes visible, but always there. He is no longer just a man who died in 1996. He is a story, a symbol, a mirror. For climbers, he represents the razor's edge between ambition and mortality. For families, he represents loss without closure. For the world, he represents the haunting truth that some dreams are not worth the price. Tsewang Paljor never set out to become famous. He only wanted to climb a mountain with his friends, to raise his country's flag on the highest peak in the world. Instead, he became a landmark, a frozen question mark at the top of the earth. And as long as he remains there, every climber who passes him must wrestle with the same unshakable thought. Is this worth it? And if I fall, will I too be remembered only as a body on the mountain? Mount Everest is often called the top of the world. To climbers, it represents the ultimate conquest. To nations, it represents pride. To adventurers, it represents the edge of human possibility. But for Green Boots, for Tsewang Paljor, it became something else. A tomb, a warning, a mirror. Every year, hundreds of people still attempt the climb. Some succeed, some fail, and some never return. The cycle is endless. Everest does not care about fame, money, or ambition. It does not care about Instagram photos or world records. It does not care about your dreams. Everest only takes, and sometimes it keeps. Paljor was not the first. He was not the last. Today, over 200 bodies remain scattered along its slopes, frozen climbers in bright suits, lying in eternal silence. Some are named, some are not. Together, they form what climbers call the Rainbow Valley. It is not a valley of celebration. It is a cemetery. But perhaps the most haunting part of Paljor's story is not his death. It is what happened after, the dozens who walked past him in 1996, the hundreds who continued to step over him for decades. The way he was transformed from a man into a landmark, and this forces us to ask, what would we have done? If we were there, in the death zone, oxygen running out, barely able to take another step, would we have tried to save him? Or would we have walked past too? It is easy to judge from the safety of our living rooms. Harder to imagine at 8,500 meters. That is the uncomfortable truth. Everest does not just test the body, it tests the soul. In India, Tsewang Paljor was part of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, a man who had dedicated his life to service. He was brave, disciplined, loyal. On that fateful climb, he did not think of becoming famous. He thought of raising his nation's flag on the highest peak of Earth, but his legacy was stolen by the mountain. Instead of being remembered as a soldier, he is remembered as Green Boots. It is a cruel twist of fate, and yet perhaps it is also fitting, because in death, he speaks louder than in life. What does Green Boots really represent? To some, he is a symbol of human ambition gone too far. To others, he is proof of the mountain's unforgiving power. But maybe at the core, he is something even more terrifying, a reflection of us. We all chase summits in our lives. Fame, wealth, recognition. We push higher and higher, believing the view at the top will be worth it. But along the way, how many people do we step over? How many do we leave behind? Everest is not just a mountain. It is a metaphor, and Green Boots is its storyteller. Here is the final twist. Tsewang Paljor never reached the summit, but in a way he did. Not by standing on the peak, but by becoming part of it. Every climber who passes him knows his name, his story. Every documentary about Everest shows his silent figure. Every debate about ethics, ambition, and mortality returns to him. Paljor wanted to touch the sky. Instead, he became eternal, not in the way he imagined, but in a way that no one can ignore. So the next time you hear about Everest, about someone paying $60,000 to climb, about record-breaking summits, about photos of smiling climbers at the top, remember Green Boots. Remember the soldier who lies just meters below, unseen by the world celebrating above, and ask yourself, what is your Everest? What dream are you chasing? And what price are you willing to pay? Because sometimes the greatest danger is not that we will fail. It is that we will succeed, only to find that the summit costs more than we ever imagined. This was the story of Tsewang Paljor, Green Boots, the man who became a landmark on Mount Everest. A story of ambition, tragedy, and the fragile line between glory and death. At Ben Stories, we believe these forgotten lives deserve to be remembered, not as landmarks, not as statistics, but as human beings with dreams, families, and stories worth telling. If this story moved you, share it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Would you have stopped, or would you have kept climbing? And don't forget to subscribe to Ben Stories, because the world is full of mysteries, tragedies, and truths that deserve to be told. The summit may belong to a few, but the story belongs to all of us.